Hello and welcome to another episode of the Express Economist. Today we'll be talking about the great Indian poverty debate. As you know, poverty is a massive issue in India, but often gets hugely debated because we are unclear about how we measure it and what are the final results. And to debate and discuss this and to get some explanations on this, I have with me a very special guest, Professor Santosh Mehrotra, who's the visiting professor at Center for Development Studies in the University of Bath in UK. Thank you, sir, for joining us on the Express Economist. As many of you might know, World Bank has just come out with its latest report on poverty numbers, and it has shown that there's a historic reversal in the reduction of poverty. Basically, what the World Bank is saying in its report is that up until 2015, for 3 decades, poverty was falling quite sharply. And then since 2015, that rate had slowed down. And then came the COVID pandemic and then the Ukraine war. And that created a reversal. And so now we are seeing across the board in the world, poverty numbers going up and even inequalities going up. And the World Bank says two very remarkable things, and we'll start off the debate, the discussion from there. The first thing for World Bank says is that it seems unlikely that the global goal of eliminating extreme poverty by 2030 looks unlikely, and because of these reversals. The second thing it says is that at one place it says that 70 million people were pushed into poverty in 2020 after the COVID pandemic. At another place, it also says that 56 million people were pushed into poverty in India. So which means that of the 70 million that were pushed into poverty in 2020 across the world, 56 million were in India, which is roughly 80%. So 8 out of 10 people who were pushed into poverty in 2020 as a result of the COVID pandemic were in India. Professor Mehrotra, two things. Does this data surprise you? And what do you make of it in terms of, because you've looked at poverty numbers for a very long time, what do you make of them?
Well, Udit, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. The numbers don't surprise me at all. The numbers are exactly what you would expect, that India accounts for a very significant share of the total number of people who are pushed into poverty. And essentially, there are two reasons why this would be the case. Because while China is the biggest population in the world, we are the second biggest population and very, very close on their heels. China did not suffer as much from COVID in 2020, which is the year for which we have estimates. So the impact and they controlled it better. And they didn't impose a national lockdown. They imposed lockdowns only in Wuhan city and in Hubei province, and also in Shanghai and in Beijing, but they didn't impose a national lockdown. It was nowhere as strict as ours was. So that was one big difference. And ours was very sudden national lockdowns and one of the strictest lockdowns and in the world. So our economy contracted by 6.6%, as the RBI told us. When the world economy contracted by 3.1%, and China actually grew in the year 2020. It actually was one of the few countries, major economies of the world. So I'm not surprised. That's one reason. The second reason was the size of our stimulus was nominally appearing to be very large, especially on the credit side. The liquidity stimulus was very large. In fact, the IMF estimates that in 2020, our credit stimulus and liquidity stimulus was of the order of 6.7% of GDP, when the emerging market economies, monetary policy stimulus was barely 1.9% of GDP. And this would be one reason why our inflation rate has continued to be so large. And then our fiscal stimulus was actually a fraction of what even the emerging market economies put in place. So emerging market economies' fiscal stimulus during COVID was 4.7% of GDP. And ours was barely 2.1% of GDP, which is even lower than what we had put in place at the time of the global economic crisis of 2008. So our economic response to in addition to our health systems response, was much poorer in design. And we paid the price for that. And therefore, many more millions went into poverty in our country as compared to the other major economies of the world. So this is what I make of it. I mean, I'm also answering your second question as to why this might be the case. And this is really what I make of it. And I think it is tragic. Yeah. And this was coming, just one last sentence, Udit. This was, please remember, it was coming on the heels of, I mean, our contraction of more than double the global contraction in 2020 was coming on a very sharply slowing economy over the 3 years preceding COVID. So back to you.
Yeah, I mean, one of the remarkable numbers that I also found was that, I mean, they made a pie chart, and we'll pull that up perhaps, that in terms of absolute number of people living under poverty, India, in terms of countries, India is the country with the highest number of people living in poverty. And I was looking at the data, they have different poverty lines. So the extreme poverty line has now been updated to $2.15 a day. So if you spend $2.15, these are international dollars. So on PPP,
at purchasing power price, at purchasing power parity price.
Yeah. So basically $2.15, I think, would be something like 46, 47 rupees. So if you spend 46, 47 rupees all told in a day, that's the extreme poverty line. And I think the other number was $3.65. And what the World Bank report suggested was that there were around 595 million Indians living below the $3.65 mark, which is, again, nothing much, there's hardly any amount. So that's a fairly vast number of people living at fairly vulnerable or sort of starvation level of poverty lines. And that's by World Bank standards. And we are still not talking about the national estimates, because one thing that I wanted to ask you about is, even the World Bank report says that the World Bank numbers are for global poverty estimation. They have a caveat saying that do not look necessarily for specific country-specific numbers, because it is best to go to national poverty lines for country-specific numbers. Now, that is where a lot of problem has emerged in India, because since 2011, I don't think we've had an update on India's national poverty numbers, which is quite remarkable for a country struggling with the maximum number of poverty to not actually update its poverty numbers. So can you tell our readers exactly what has happened that we've not been able to update the poverty number, national poverty numbers, what that poverty line is, and you've perhaps, you've done your work on that, you've created your own estimate on that, and where do you think poverty now stands according to you? I think your last estimate was for 2020. So where do you think?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So in 2011-12, you see, a consumption expenditure survey was done. And in our country, as in all countries of the world, consumption expenditure surveys at the household level are carried out by the statistical organization of the country, in our case, the NSS. And every 5 years, this has been done. Unfortunately, when ours was done 6 years after 2011-12, it was done in 2017-18. The government didn't like the outcome. Data got leaked, but the government killed the data. The data which got leaked told us the following, that rural consumption had actually declined. And please remember that rural areas account for about 2/3 of the country's population. Rural consumption had declined by 8% from 11-12 levels in 17-18, and urban consumption had increased by 2% compared to 11-12. Now, the overall result of that would have been that poverty would have increased, which is the result that we have. I mean, I have personally done estimates of this, and we can come back and talk about that. Now, since 2017-18, we have not had yet another consumption expenditure survey. It is true that COVID intervened. And now that sort of mostly COVID is behind us, in 2022-23, a consumption expenditure survey is ongoing. And we will probably hear the results of this data after it's been, you finish collecting in June of 23, only after the election results of 2024. That's what's likely. I mean, I'm guessing, but this is what's likely, because this is exactly what happened with the government's own periodic labor force survey, which had already been collected for 17-18, and we had learned that unemployment rates had increased to a 45-year high in 2017-18 in India, but the government didn't release that data until after the 2019 election results came out, and we realized that what the NSS had estimated was actually correct. So, in other words, what I'm suggesting here, Udit, is that the labor force survey estimates about rising joblessness, falling wages that came out in 17-18 would tend to confirm what we were learning from the killed consumption expenditure survey data, that, the rural consumption had declined and urban consumption had barely increased by 2%. So anyway, there was, I think, growing evidence that poverty would have increased between 11-12 and 17-18. Why should we be surprised? Because let's just remember that in November of 2016, suddenly at 4 hours notice, demonetization happened, and that had a very severe impact on the unorganized sector. Generally, in the non-farm sector, the unorganized sector accounts for most of the non-farm jobs, and the unorganized sector includes the agriculture sector, and farmers who had already been reeling from 2 drought years, they suffered massive declines in income even in 2016 when they brought their produce to the farm, because there was no cash available for them to be paid. So anyway, so this is where we stand, and it's very unfortunate that we are in this situation, because please remember, and this is my closing statement, please remember that already, because the economy was slowing and joblessness was rising and wages were falling all the way till 2019, the impact of COVID would have enhanced the impact on the poor. And therefore, if the World Bank, as you began by telling us, has seen an increase in the number of the poor by 56 million between 2019 and 2020. I think we need to point that out.
Yeah.
So they've made some estimates for 19 and for 20, and they've said 56 million increase. And that number is not that different from my own estimate for the absolute increase in poverty that took place.
So tell me something, our last estimates of the national poverty line, which was based on the Tendulkar committee report, had one particular number in 2011. Can you tell us what happened to that number? What was that number and what happened to it according to what you calculated, and for which year? And have you calculated also for the COVID impact or the Ukraine impact? I mean, that's too early, but I mean, maybe I just wanted to ask.
So we haven't calculated for the COVID impact in 2021, but we might have only minorly. I don't think we've captured the COVID impact. What we've captured for the 2019-20 period is sort of mostly pre-COVID. But let me give you a slight historical background before I come to the most recent period. You see, as I say, as we began by saying, consumption expenditure surveys in India have been carried out every 5 years. And the first proper consistent estimate in India we have for poverty is for 1973-74. Then we have an estimate for 83-84. We have an estimate for 93-94. And then we have an estimate for 2004-5. Now, I mean, I'm abstracting for those estimates which were done in between for simplicity's sake. The more important point here is that from 73-74 all the way till 2004-5, while the incidence of poverty, meaning the share of the population below the poverty line, was consistently falling, it fell all the way from 54% down to about 34% in 2004-5. The absolute number of poor remained stable. By the previous poverty line calculated by the Planning Commission, which is called the Lakdawala poverty line, who was used to be a member of the Planning Commission. So for some 30 years, the absolute number of the poor remained constant at around 320 million or so, because the population was increasing. But some people can say, well, at least we should congratulate ourselves that the absolute number of poor did not increase by a consistent poverty line over a 30-year period. But nevertheless, the absolute number did not fall. Now, please remember that post 2004, all the way till 2013-14, the economy grew at 8% per annum, which is unprecedented in our country's history. There had been some very small decline in the absolute number of the poor between 93 and 2004, because after the economic reforms began, our growth rate had really significantly picked up compared to the 80s. And the absolute numbers came down by about 18 million, was the estimate by the Planning Commission. Now, as a result of the phenomenal growth rate and our dream run between 2004 and 14, the consumption expenditure survey told us that not only did the incidence fall, meaning the share of the population below the poverty line fell from 34% to 22% in 2011-12, the absolute number of poor in India by a higher poverty line compared to the Lakdawala poverty line, which is called now the Tendulkar poverty line, fell by 140 million. That means 14 crore people rose above the poverty line in a matter of about 7 or 8 years because of that fast growth rate and non-farm jobs being created at a rate of 7.5 million new non-farm jobs every year. Now I'll bring the story up to date. You see, because there has been no consumption expenditure survey, what we have done, and this is in the public domain, we've estimated using the periodic labor force surveys consumption and expenditure questions for 17-18 and for 19-20, what happened to poverty. And although one cannot say hand on heart that this is a hard number, the fact of the matter is that we do come up with an estimate for 17-18, which shows that poverty actually already increased by 17-18 itself. And the reasons I've explained to you earlier, why it should have, and also I've told you that there was a consumption expenditure survey which told us that rural consumption had actually fallen. Then we come to sort of 19-20, and please remember between 17-18 and 19-20, we know that growth rates fall. And we also know that non-farm job growth between 2012 and 19, my estimates are they fell from the 7.5 million per annum until 12 to 2.9 million per annum in the period between 13 and 19, pre-COVID. So non-farm jobs were growing very slowly. Now listen to what happens post-COVID in the last 2 years. we all know, we've already said this, that the economy contracted more than double the global economy's contraction in 2020. So we shouldn't be surprised if the World Bank tells us that, the poverty has increased by 56 million only between 2019 and 20. And you see, my estimate of poor, absolute number of poor by the Tendulkar poverty line projected to 1920 was a lower bound of an increase by 15 million over that period from 2012 to 2019, and an upper bound of about 76 million, depending upon methodology, which I think we don't have the time to go into.
Yeah.
But notice that it was already increasing prior to 2019, which is the reason why people like me and many others have actually rejected arguments made in two papers, one in an IMF working paper by India's executive director to the fund, Surjit Bhalla, and also by Dr. Virmani, who claimed that poverty has fallen very sharply during this government's term, which is not logical for a variety of reasons. And I can say very briefly what the methodological and the empirical flaws in the Virmani argument is.
So what you're saying is that, between 2011 and 2019, even before the COVID pandemic, there was a considerable slide in India's poverty. If I understand correctly, you're saying that from both the perspective of percentage of population below the poverty line and the absolute number of people below the poverty line, both went up.
Well, incidence did not rise till 2019, but absolute number rose, no question. Incidence did not rise.
Okay.
But absolute number rises, not surprising, because one, population is growing, economy is slowing, joblessness is growing, real wages are falling.
Right.
Trends which worsen post-COVID.
Okay. But there are many who have in the past talked about how India has done very well on poverty alleviation in the last few years, which seems a little odd when you look at, as you mentioned, India's own record with slowing growth rate even before the COVID pandemic and then getting hit quite badly during the pandemic. Would you care to just explain to our viewers why you think any estimation which says that poverty has declined is perhaps misplaced?
Right. Let me explain. Yeah. So, first of all, I've already said that, when we were in our dream run, we were growing really fast, we were creating non-farm jobs, and real wages were rising. I'm starting with that background because you will see that the trend reverses in the period since 2013. So the growth rate is much lower post 2013, which is the last year of the previous regime, but it barely sort of tends to hold up till about 2015, and then comes demonetization, GST, all of which knocks the MSMEs sideways, and demonetization knocked agriculture also sideways, and joblessness then begins to sort of increase. And this is, please understand, this is happening at a time when the share in the working age population is rising. Those who are looking for work, who could be in work, is rising. So this is one reason why, first, there would be a slowdown in the reduction of poverty. One, because growth rate slows. Two, because joblessness increases. And three, because joblessness increases, in other words, non-farm job growth, as I said to you, falls to 2.9 million per annum. Real wages either stagnate or they fall. And this is true. And even, Mr. Bhalla agrees with this. They fall for for regular workers, casual workers, and those who earn livelihoods from self-employment. Earning, I mean, I've written on this, and in all cases, you'll be shocked to know. I mean, I'll give you some estimates of for 2019-20, those who are in self-employment, 52% of them, Udit, earn less than 200 rupees a day. That's below the Tendulkar poverty line. And about 46% of our workforce is self-employed. In addition, regular salary, those who have regular salaries, 21% of them earn less than 200 rupees a day in 1920. That's below poverty. And an additional 19% earn less than 300. So you say 40% earn less than 300. 2/3 earn less than 300 among self-employed, and casual workers, again, 2/3 earn less than 300. So when this is the state of real wages, why should we be surprised that that poverty should be increasing? Not very significantly, as I'm saying, before COVID. And when COVID shock comes, the economy contracts, joblessness shoots up, real wages obviously collapse. So even if there is 5 rupees a kilo, 5 rupees free grain rations, ordinary people don't live on free grain ration alone, on rice or wheat. They consume other things. So the point is that these are the reasons why, the World Bank estimate of increasing poverty 19 to 20 is completely legitimate and understandable, coming as it does upon a slowing economy, rising joblessness, and stagnant or falling real wages.
Right. It makes sense to if you were to look at broader indicators of growth and unemployment, to imagine that poverty numbers could not have been going in a very different direction just because there is some free grain scheme, or there is Manrega numbers going up. I mean, the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. Even the World Bank's latest report mentions that MGNRA, NREGA has been very useful, and so has perhaps the food grain scheme for helping. Otherwise the poverty numbers perhaps would be even more poor. But tell me something. So is it incorrect to we in repeated interviews we have talked about how the rest of the world is sort of has done poorly because they gave a lot of fiscal outgo and now are facing inflation and all those recessionary issues because of the Ukraine war also. And a lot of people have patted their own backs in India, saying that we didn't give money to the poor at that time, and now look, we are so well placed. But this seems to be this poverty number, this 56 million going up during COVID, that being almost 80% of all poverty, we being the number one in the number of poor people. This is perhaps rightfully the counter argument to saying, if you did not spend, then this is the impact, and this doesn't get captured in GDP straight away, but this perhaps is the impact. Is that correct?
You're absolutely correct. This is exactly my understanding, that what has recovered is the organized sector. What has not recovered post-COVID is the unorganized sector. Yes, the agriculture is doing fine. So, but the problem with agriculture is that it is coping with about 44 million new additional workers who came back from urban areas, the reverse migration that we all knew about. So those who returned to agriculture, has led to the share of agriculture and total employment rising in India, and the absolute number of workers in agriculture shooting up, when in fact it was that number of those in agriculture was consistently falling from 2004-05 to all the way to 19. So we've reversed a process of structural transformation, of structural change, and manufacturing jobs were collapsing prior to COVID. You won't believe it that, the most labor-intensive manufacturing sectors are 5: wooden furniture, leather and footwear, food processing, textiles and garments. These account for 50% of manufacturing jobs. Prior to COVID, we saw an absolute decline in jobs in these labor-intensive sectors. So why are you surprised that on the one hand, wages should be falling? If jobs are not increasing, yet the number of people looking for work is increasing, then wages should be falling. And that's exactly what happened. So poverty was falling. And please remember, manufacturing jobs will be better paying jobs than those in agriculture. Now, let's come back to the COVID impact. So the absolute number of workers in agriculture was consistently dropping for 15 years from 2004 to 19. And then suddenly in 2020, there's an absolute increase. PLFS data, meaning government data, suggesting 44 million people join agriculture. Most of them are those who are returnees, reverse migration. And believe it or not, for those who are thinking that in 2021, there would have been a reverse migration back to the urban areas, well, the government's own data doesn't suggest that. There's still an additional 7 to 8 million people who in agriculture in 2021 compared to 2020.
Not completely on solutions.
Right.
Now that we have at least some evidence, which perhaps the government cannot just totally deny, to suggest that such a sharp spike in poverty levels, right. What do you think 1 or 2 or 3 things that the government should do if it wants to address this growing acute poverty levels?
Udit, one of the things that we have not talked about is that non-money metric measures of poverty have also worsened. What do I mean by that? That education access disappeared for millions of children in our country for about 2 years because schools were closed. Our schools were closed like those in other parts of the world. But our children were already, very poor learners. They had very poor levels of learning. And in addition, there were six-year-olds who were waiting in 2020 to join school. And for them, they've become 8-year-olds. And now they will enter class 1 after, schools have reopened. So in other words, those children who would have entered have not got any education. Those who were in school, they've not got any education. This means that there is a lifetime loss of learning here and a lifetime loss of earnings for these people. This is an additional reason why the World Bank estimates, and rightly, that the 2030 global goal of poverty reduction is not going to be. So the implication, to answer your question, is that there has to be a newfound focus on school education for the youngest, especially those in elementary education. And, there are many details. I don't think you have time to go into that. And that's a very labor-intensive activity because there are many millions of school teachers who've not been appointed, despite the fact that there are sanctioned posts. So that has to be an area of focus. I mean, there are about 1 lakh teacher posts in schools in UP alone, which are vacant. Secondly, health is a very labor-intensive sector, and because COVID has caused so much health level damage, it's critical that the government invests more in health. It's also a labor-intensive sector, particularly in the labor. So that's an additional.
And it employs women. And it employs women.
Where the labor force participation rate is falling. The third thing the government is doing is, capex, increased capex. But, the capex also needs to be done more by the state governments because private investment is not increasing. And it's critical, finally, that the government reduces taxes on diesel and petrol and gas so that inflation rates come down, especially in a context where commodity prices in the world have been increasing. And if they did that, the burden on the poor would fall and they might begin to consume more. Aggregate demand would pick up. If aggregate demand picks up, especially in a context where exports might be impacted adversely on account of the economic sanctions on account of Ukraine, it's perfectly possible that if demand picks up, then private investment picks up, then jobs pick up. So Three major actions.
Right. So, I mean, thanks for giving these solutions. It's very important for people and viewers to understand that, you know, it's a fundamental mistake to imagine that India doesn't have a demand problem. We have a massive demand slowdown. We had that even before COVID, and COVID just totally destroyed demand. So the solutions have to be oriented towards improving demand. Yes, supply is important, and nobody can say that, you know, don't do anything on supply, but demand is the main problem for any sustainable recovery. Professor Mehrotra, very grateful for your time and your insights. Thank you for being part of the Express Economist. And I hope the viewers found some value in the way we have tried to explain the massive confusion around poverty and what's happening to poverty. If you like the episode, please press like and subscribe our channel. And we'll see you next week. Thank you.